Hi, it's Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll be taking a look at a very budget motherboard for those of you looking at dipping your toes into the world of AMD's AM5 platform and the current Ryzen 7000 series processors. This is a very cost-effective board. It is essentially the cheapest board you can get, which still runs on the B650 chipset, which I feel is somewhat of a compromise, but it isn't quite as much as a compromise as dropping down to the A620 chipset, which has even more limitations, and obviously you lose things such as overclocking abilities and all that kind of good stuff. So in today's video, we're going to go through, do a quick unboxing, see what it's all about, go through all the ports and specifications, and you can work out whether or not this is going to be suitable for your next build. So first of all, take a look at the packaging. The packaging is extremely basic, as you'd expect from a low entry-level board. So this is part of the ultra durable range from Gigabyte, and the motherboard is the B650MK, or M space K, not a dash. That's going to make it very difficult for search optimization, but still, that's my problem, not yours. As I said, it runs on the B650 chipset, so you still get all the cool features available to that, such as overclocking and being able to increase certain aspects of the chipset which you're otherwise locked out of on the A620 chipset. This board has dual channel DDR5 support up to a whopping DDR5 8000 megatransfers per second, although I think realistically most people, if you're buying this sort of platform, you're going to be absolutely fine with DDR5 5600 or 6000, which currently does seem to be the sweet spot for AM5 processors. On the back of the box, it goes into some of the key features of this board, such as the VRM. Now the VRM is actually quite weak. It's an 8+2+2 setup, and of the 8 primary phases, those are actually split using doublers, so it's a kind of 4+4 setup. Not the best, and if you're certainly looking at using higher tier processors on this, such as possibly Ryzen 7, Ryzen 9, then obviously do temper your expectations. This ideally is for those entry-level processors, such as the Ryzen 5, and potentially APUs as they become available. A really nice feature of this, which I really like and has been a long time in coming, is the PCI Express Easy Latch system. So this allows you to remove graphics cards a lot easier than it has been previously. This has always been one of those kind of contentious things, trying to remove a graphics card. Normally you end up getting a long screwdriver and kind of poking at the clasp to try and remove the GPU, whereas with this, got a really nice big latch there, which is easy to access and will make graphics card changes that much easier. Also, a couple of other features of note. So we do have 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. This is supplied by Realtek in form of the RTL 8125 chipset. This is backwards compatible with gigabit and 10100 if you are limited to those speeds. Also, we do have USB 3.2 Gen 2, so this is going to provide up to 10 gigabit per second transfers on the USB Type A and Type C ports on the back of the motherboard. At the bottom, it's got some information about the chipset and also a picture of the layout of the I/O, so I'll quickly put those on the screen so you can check those out. When we take a look at what is actually inside the box, so clearly you're going to get a motherboard. In terms of accessories, it's an extremely limited affair. You get a single SATA connection, so for one drive, if you need more, obviously you can buy them. In some ways I like it because a lot of the time these kind of do get wasted, but at least you get one, possibly two would have been nice, but yeah, it is part of those cost-cutting measures. Also, because of the budget nature of the motherboard, it does have a non-captive I/O shield, so you do need to install this into the case before you put your motherboard in. Not the end of the world. It would have been nice to have an integrated I/O shield, which was fixed on the system, but again, if it's saving a few quid, then I'm pretty happy to do so. Also, you get your regulatory information, and also there is a multilingual installation guide, which is extremely basic and kind of pointless. So now we can take a look at the motherboard itself. So dimension-wise, this is a micro ATX motherboard designed for micro ATX cases. Potentially it will fit in some ITX enclosures as well, but do check before ordering. If you're planning to save some money and put this into an ATX format case, you certainly can do, although you will be left with somewhat of a gap at the bottom of your case. Not a problem, but just thought I'd point it out for those that are beginners. So let's take a quick tour around the motherboard and see what connectivity we have, and I'll give you some ideas of some of the speeds and technologies used. So starting up in this top left-hand corner, we've got an 8-pin solid EPS connection. So this gives you some idea of the power limitations. Obviously it is just a single 8-pin, which is going to be fine for most people, but again, if you're looking for those higher core count or higher performance processors, you may be lacking slightly, but for most people I think it's going to be absolutely fine. As it stands at the moment, in terms of CPU support, this supports up to the latest and greatest of AM5 processors. As always, I'll put links in the video description so you can go to the CPU support section to find out more. As we referred to a little bit earlier, the VRM setup is relatively basic, but it seems to get the job done. There is an additional cooler over the top of the VRMs, which some A620 motherboards don't include, so there is a little bit of cooling on the VRMs. Again, do limit your expectations. High performance processors are probably not designed to be used on this board, at least in demanding tasks. In the center there, we've got the AM5 socket. Now, something which is much improved on the AM5 platform over AM4 is the way that the processors are actually contained on the motherboard. The actual backplate is now fixed in place, so we don't have that problem where if you remove some of the retention modules that the backplate falls off into the back of your case. It is all completely fixed in here, and we do have the new ILM which locks the processor into place very much like modern Intel processors. Moving across to the top, so we have a single CPU header. There are actually 3 headers on this motherboard for fans, so one primarily for your CPU and 2 additional fan ones. All 3 of them do support Smart Fan 6, so you do have the ability to connect up various different devices, whether they be PWM, DC controlled, AIO pumps, all those kinds of things, and you can configure that in the BIOS. Moving across, we've got 4 RAM slots. As I said, this is DDR5, so supporting presently up to DDR5 8000 mega transfers per second. And with the 4 slots there, you can support up to 192 gigabytes of RAM spread out over 48 gig sticks. Of course, if you just want to put a simple 16 gig or 32 gig kit on there, it's no problem at all, and it does support dual channel. Moving along a little bit further, so on this far side, we have a digital addressable RGB header. So that is your 3-pin 5-volt addressable RGB. There's also another one at the bottom as well, which we'll take a look at later. You've got your standard 24-pin power connector. Underneath that, an additional fan header, so again, PWM or DC fans or AIO pumps, that sort of thing, whatever you choose. Another nice inclusion is the fact we do have a front panel USB Type-C connection to go to your case. That is something which is quite often missing on some cheaper boards, so nice to see that included, now that USB Type-C connectivity on cases is becoming more commonplace. Underneath that, hidden underneath this heatsink, is the B650 chipset, and across from that we've got 4 SATA ports on here, all of which are run from the chipset itself, so we don't have any of that weird stuff going on with PCI Express sharing, in terms of if you plug in a SATA drive you lose the ability to use an M.2 slot. That isn't the case on this setup. Underneath the SATA ports there is a USB 3.0 front panel header, which is angled nicely inwards. I like this when it comes to actually building. I find this a lot easier rather than having a bulky connector facing inwards that you've then got to bend the cables back round 180 degrees on themselves. At least with this you can use a 90-degree bend quite easily. At the bottom you've got all of your input and output for your front panel connectivity, power switches, etc. There's also a specific switch on here as well, which you can connect up, so you can control what it actually does when you press your reset button. You can connect it up so it will either go straight to BIOS, you can set it so it will go to safe mode. Most people probably won't use it, but it's there if you want to. Also, you do have your CMOS reset pins there as well, so if you just want to reset the BIOS, if you've dialed in some settings which aren't working quite right, you can just reset them quite easily without having to actually gain access to the battery, which is more than likely going to be covered up by your graphics card. Moving along at the bottom, so there's another fan header, so that is the last of the 3. Next up, there is only a single USB 2.0 front panel header. This I think is going to be a slight limitation for some people, but don't worry, you can always get one of those adapters which will convert that into a dual, into 3, 4, whatever you want to do. NZXT are quite well known for doing those sorts of things, so if you've got multiple USB 2.0 internal devices that need connecting, you can do, but it's just a shame there's only one port on there as standard. Moving across from that at the bottom there, so we've got 2 more RGB connections, so one of which is the 12-volt RGB, and also there is a 3-pin 5-volt addressable RGB matching up with the one which is in the top of the motherboard. Next up, there's 2 pinouts, one of which is for an additional TPM header, so if you want to use a dedicated TPM device you can do, although TPM will be built into the processor generally, or FTPM anyway, but if you do have a specific need for adding an additional TPM device, you certainly can do. Next up, there is a serial connection. That is for debugs using port 80. That is more for Gigabyte rather than the end user. And moving along to the end, then we have our audio. So this is a Realtek RTL 897, supporting up to 7.1 audio. And you've got the capacitors there and also the front panel output. So yeah, no real surprises there. It is on isolated tracks as well, which in theory will make sound reproduction slightly better than it should be. Now we can take a look at the PCI Express ports and your M.2 connectivity. So we'll start from the top. So we've got at the top here, so we've got PCI Express Gen 4 x 16 slot, fully wired for times 16. And of course we've got that PCI Express Easy Latch. I like this a lot. For taking out graphics cards, this is going to be an absolute game changer. I'm really glad to see that has been added. Something else about the positioning of the slot itself. Now I've said this before in previous videos, when you're building in a micro ATX setup, the problem is in some instances, depending on the graphics card you're using, is if the slot is a little bit lower, it brings the whole card down. And if you've got a case where it's solid at the bottom, you're basically going to get limited airflow into your graphics card, which kind of defeats the whole point of spending your money on a nice graphics card when it's going to be thermally throttling. So actually having the PCI Express slot actually as high as it possibly can be on the board gives your graphics card a little bit more opportunity to breathe. Underneath that, we've got the first of our M.2 slots. So this is running from the processor. This is PCI Express Gen 4 x 4. And underneath that, there's also an additional PCI Express Gen 4x4. Now the problem is with this, both of those actually run from the processor rather than from the chipset. So the processor itself's only got 20 lanes. So if you're allocating 16 lanes to the top slot, that means these two are going to share lanes. So if you've only got one drive installed, not a problem. You can go all the way up to PCI Express Gen 4x4. If you install another drive in the bottom slot for two drives, you are going to be limited to PCI Express Gen 4 x 2. Now that isn't going to be too much of a problem, but if you then install a PCI Express Gen 3 drive, you're going to be limited to PCI Express Gen 3 x 2. This is still faster than a lot of SSD drives, but I wanted to point it out just to make sure that you know what you're getting into. So if you buy a graphics card that uses times 16 and two PCI Express Gen 4 x 4 drives, you are going to be sharing bandwidth. Now of course, looking at how graphics cards are going, a lot of graphics cards now are using PCI Express Gen 4 x 8 slots. So in which case you can go into the BIOS using bifurcation. You can allocate times 8 to the graphics card slot, giving you the full PCI Express Gen 4 x 4 to both of those additional slots underneath. Obviously, your graphics card is going to be the factor there which defines which of those setups you can use. We will be doing a full BIOS tour on this board when I get my processor. So if you want to see how that works and how we can do the bifurcation to get the best out of your M.2s, make sure you stay subscribed to find out more. Further into the M.2, so the top one, as you can see, there is a heatsink there. There is a thermal pad on there as well. So for cooling drives, that is no problem. Just a single screw to remove it, put it back in. Will support up to 2280 drives. You can move the pin a little bit, but then you lose the ability to use the heat shield. Most drives these days tend to be 2280 size, which is that full width. So yeah, it isn't too much of a problem. When it comes to the drive underneath, you can use longer drives. So the 22110 or the 2280, those aren't a problem. And I like the fact that they've actually included this really cheap and effective method of latching down your M.2 drives. Just a plastic push pin, which you can remove. There's a pin there and it just holds the drive in place. So no fiddly screws to mess around with. Relatively straightforward to do, even if you don't have the utmost dexterity. At the bottom, rounding things off, we do have a PCI Express Gen 3 x 1 slot running at =1 speeds. This is connected to the chipset. So the SATA and the PCI Express Gen 3 are all done through the chipset. This one, and this one are all done via the CPU. So I think that's pretty much it for what is actually on the board. Let's take a look at the I/O on the back and see what we've got there. So the I/O is relatively meager on here, not a great deal, but most of the bases are covered here. So we do have a DisplayPort and HDMI ports. DisplayPort will support up to 4K 144 Hz. The HDMI, you're limited to 4K 60 Hz, although it does support other features, HDMI 2.1, etc, etc. You've also got 4 USB 2.0 ports and an old-fashioned PS2 connection if you want to use that. I think that's absolutely fine. Having 4 USB 2.0s, keyboard, mouse, maybe a printer, that sort of thing, I think that's absolutely fine. Where things do look up a little bit more, but they are slightly limited, is what we've got here. So we've got USB 3.2 Gen 2. So those are 10 gigabit per second. So we've got a Type A and a Type C. Also next up, there's USB 3.2 Gen 1, so 5 gigabit per second, 2 ports there. And above that, you've got the Realtek RTL 8125 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, which again can be used with gigabit and lower speed should you wish to. And nestled in between that is the BIOS flashback button. This is something which is going to be pretty much standard on all AM5 boards going forward. I think it's going to be very difficult to find one that doesn't have it. It is going to be useful for if new processors come out and you pick up one of these boards and maybe it's been stuck on the shelf for a while, it hasn't got an updated BIOS on it, so you can quickly flash the BIOS before you install your new shiny processor, which is excellent. Something which isn't excellent is the audio. So again, RTL 897 chipset, not particularly great. You've only got 3 connections there, 3.5mm jacks. So you've got your speakers or headphones, you've got your line and also your microphone port. If you do want to do 7.1 audio, as per usual with these kind of setups, you can actually tie in the front panel connections, which are on your case, to those to give you those additional analog outputs should you want to. I think most people probably will use a USB DAC these days, but certainly the option is there should you need to. And while we're looking at the board, a quick look at the back here. So you can see we've got that solid mounting plate. This is the really nice thing about AM5. So this bracket basically is kind of welded to the board. It won't fall off. So when you do take off the AM5 brackets at the top and bottom there, which are the same as the AM4 ones, normally with AM4 you undo those and basically the back plate will want to fall off. This is all captive, so you don't have any issues there. The only thing you do have is slight compatibility issues with certain AM4 processor coolers. But again, that is going to be down to the individual. Do make sure that the cooler you're using supports AM5. So there you go, there is an overview of the Gigabyte ultra durable B650M Space K. Let me know what you think about this one in the comment section. Now I do know, before you mention it, that Hardware Unboxed did a review of a load of B650 motherboards, and this was one of the ones that they kind of said you should avoid. Now they are actually quite lucky being in Australia, and also for those watching in the US, this board is actually considerably cheaper in those regions, and in terms of what is available, which is better, things such as the ASRock B650 HDV-M.2, which was one that they actually recommended. That one is considerably more expensive here in the UK at the time of recording. Now, obviously, if that changes, that would probably be the board I would be looking towards getting, or possibly one of the Pro RS models. Ultimately, if you want to save money, and this board has all the features that you actually need and you have no issues with it, and you're not planning on going crazy with your processor, I think this is going to be absolutely fine. But as it stands at the moment, this is the cheapest B650 board in the UK that I feel actually makes sense for new system builds. But that is what I think about it. Let me know what you think about it in the comment section below. But I think that's going to wrap things up. I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.